Welcome to the DDP podcast channel. We sincerely hope you will enjoy this episode. Don't forget to turn on your notification bell and to follow us right here on Spotify for more podcast episodes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us today. Welcome back to DDP Podcasts. Today I'm joined by Sharon from Lawyers for Human Rights, an incredible human rights activist and advocate for social justice. As always, our guest's description and the job that they do and the kind of work that they do is always attached to our description below. And I think I'm going to figure out the title of what we're actually going to call our discussion today a little bit later on. Obviously, anybody who's listening right now, there already is a title, but I'm still working through it in my mind because I really think this particular conversation that Sharon and I are going to have now is a little bit unique to what DDP podcasts usually do because it's fresh news and something that's still being discussed today. But before we get into that, Sharon, how are you doing today? And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I am doing all right. Under the circumstances.
I'm not sure when listeners you're listening to this, but for those of you who might not know, on the 31st of August, which today on the day of recording was yesterday, South Africa had one of its worst fires in history at Johannesburg CBD, where currently the death toll is sitting at 74 people who have passed away, and 12 of those people were children. And a tragedy has been turned completely into a political conversation and a complete disregard for life. And Sharon, I was thinking maybe we can just unpack this incident a little bit more. What are your thoughts on the current environment and the reaction that has occurred regarding the fire?
Thanks, Yanga. I mean, we are still getting reports from various NGOs and people on the ground who are telling us how families are, those who survived the fire, the additional trauma that they're going through, having suffered, either seeing their loved ones burning, having struggled to escape. They're now being denied access to the mortuaries unless they can provide documentation. So that's the current phase. But I just wanted to comment on your point about the politics of all of this. And I think, nothing in our lives living on the African continent or in particular in South Africa is not political because of our past, because of colonization, because of apartheid. But what we need to denounce, what we need to call out is the way in which political parties turn life and death issues into a political football to score points and to win votes. And I think that is the worst form of injustice that we can mete out to people who have, in this instance, as you pointed out, it's one of our worst in our history. The enormity of this crisis is unmatched in a residential area with the kind of impact that it's had and the lives that have been lost. And you get politicians trying to score points and the blame game.
Sharon, I just want to go to the press statement that Lawyers for Human Rights had released regarding this building fire. And perhaps if you can, maybe just unpack for our readers, firstly, the work that Lawyers for Human Rights does, one, and number two, the role of the Constitution in a situation like this right now.
So Lawyers for Human Rights has a number of programs, and the Refugee and Migrant Rights Program is one of its biggest programs, and it's been around for decades. In fact, I think it was formed at the time of the writing of our Refugee Act, which has now recently been amended. We have also a land and housing and property rights program. And I think we see over the years the convergence in terms of our work with what can only be described as the criminalization of poverty in our country. And there you have the most vulnerable, and this is South Africans, predominantly Black African South Africans, and you have our brothers and sisters from the African continent who are bearing the brunt, the disproportionate impact of poverty and unemployment on the majority of people who live in this country who are Black.
Right.
And so, for example, with the land and housing, they deal with a number of issues around unlawful evictions, and in that there would be migrants, South Africans, and we need to be assisting. We also have an environmental rights program, and there again, another overlap with the kind of forced displacement that we're seeing on the continent, and how forced displacement has been, you not only have it because of conflict and fear of persecution because of your sexual orientation, but also because it's unlivable given the impact of the climate crisis. And that's also political, because we know that the climate crisis, there's a disproportionate impact on sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the impact on land and livelihoods compared to the North, which are really the culprits and the delinquents in the contribution to the what we're suffering and the consequences of the climate crisis.
I think we're going to come back to that conversation of climate in just a little bit, because I think it's very important, because climate change has just completely flipped quite literally the reality that we have been functioning in upside down, that overnight it can flood and you immediately are displaced and everything is completely out of your control. But we'll come back to that in just a second, on the impact that it has on how we can come to understand migration as a whole, as a human species. With the CBD fire, a lot of critique that has come out of it, and critique which, by the way, is not even rooted in any truth to a certain extent, and this complete disassociation from the reality of the matter is the phenomenon of othering. And I just want to ask you the impact of othering within South Africa, not just from a political perspective, but overall, how it impacts the relationship that South Africans have with the government.
I think it's difficult not to speak about this in the context of fake news, of how, as you said, it has, whatever is being said, the responses have no basis in evidence-based, information in what is being said. And to give you a very glib response, South Africa has joined ranks with global, world organizations in countries, like the UK, America, in blaming and scapegoating migrants, and that comes with the not only xenophobia but Islamophobia. It comes with homophobia, with anything that can divide us and blame any particular section of humanity. And it has very successfully used and abused social media to then deflect from ordinary people holding governments to account for their failure to enforce policy, for their failure to deal with the serious problems of and systemic unemployment is a global problem. That's the state in which we are living, with capitalism on steroids, with the global market consuming further and further parts of the world, and where the very nature of work has completely changed, and issues of dignity and human rights are, it's completely been thrown out the window. And so I think that's the global context, and South Africa is unfortunately following in this trend of using laws and using its sovereignty to limit the movement of people. And in our context, it has to be said that it is predominantly Black African people. We are, policing Black bodies once again. And instead of, as the 1951 Convention has set out, and the OAU Convention, around looking at this through the lenses of protection, of appreciating that people are fleeing because they have no choice. And I think that's where your point on the climate crisis must come in as well.
I think it's a very important moment now for us to unpack that, right? That this system of completely policing Black bodies, it's a system that's it's not going to work with the continued proliferation of the nature of climate change issues. And it forces states now to truly have a reality check of, you can't use this misinformation and disinformation to other people when flocks of people are kind of needing a place for refuge, needing a place for safety. And we think right now, with the impact that the Pakistan flood, for example, had on the type of relationship that was already strained between Pakistan and India, but India being one of the closest countries that Pakistanis could flee to, because of the fact that close to 3 million people were completely displaced overnight. And that makes me wonder about how our government has been acting specifically to think about Mozambicans that come over to South Africa once a climate disaster has hit the country, and the difficulty for them to be able to enter in. And so I just wanted to ask you, how do you think is the best way now for states to start understanding what migration actually is, instead of continuously spewing out the othering narrative for the sake of political gain?
I don't think that it's gonna happen on its own. I think more and more globally, states, we are seeing the ugly rise of nationalism, of national chauvinism. And it's going to take a international movement which speaks to human dignity, human rights, which speaks to a movement of human beings, where we have to be global citizens and counter the narrow nationalism of states who more and more are protecting their very, very narrow interests and literally their jobs as working in a government and a state. And then I think that is also, we speak about corruption and we speak about state capture, but I think a lot more needs to be done to expose the extent to which multinationals are forming very, I can't find the right word, but the way in which they're working with states precisely to have policies like GEAR, economic policies that are anti-poor, that are anti-equality, that are anti-transformation. And I think we have to, as people, take a stand against this, because the states are in cahoots with global capital. They're in cahoots with the big mighty nations like China and America and the UK. And it's all about protecting the markets, but protecting the markets for who? And that's the question we've got to ask.
Absolutely. I mean, I saw an interview the other day about the role that Goldman Sachs, out of all, partners and stakeholders a person could think of, but I guess it makes sense. But the role that Goldman Sachs played more than 10 years ago in the conceptualization of what we have as BRICS today. And exactly what you're just saying now, whose interests are being protected. And these anti-poor policies that are being pushed out are for whom exactly? And I think that's a very, very important conversation and point that you've just brought up there. And Sharon, I want us to chat about the role of race in the conversation of migration. I think it was highlighted very explicitly with the Ukraine conflict, kind of just how Black refugees were being treated compared to white Ukrainians, and the different treatment of receiving people from Ukraine who were fleeing the war, and even people who weren't Ukrainian but were trying to get back to the African countries, finding it difficult to leave the country, right? And there was a lot of media that was published pointing out the hypocrisy, etc. But I want to talk about it from the lens of internalized racism within our own African continent that can cause many, many, many South Africans in this case to not want brothers and sisters that look exactly like them to come into the country in order to have a better life, to escape literal death. How do you see race? You touched on it a little bit earlier, but how do you see race play out in migration issues?
It's a very, very tough question, because I think, we don't fully acknowledge and understand the extent to which violence informs us as a people.
Right.
And of course, that's rooted in our past. It's rooted in the extent of repression that was imposed on us by the apartheid regime. It's, and I can only speak to you about, what Black consciousness and the role that it played in affirming our identity as Black people, and in countering the barrage of what was spewed out by the apartheid regime. But I also feel that we haven't, taken into account adequately as a people living in South Africa, the damage going right back to slavery and the privatization of Black bodies and the ownership of Black bodies. And so there's been and so, as you speak about people from Mozambique being displaced and how are they received in South Africa, it's exactly the same as we deal with so-called economic migrants. It's exactly the same as we are dealing with, if you listen to the responses of, over 70 people have died, 12 children.
Yeah.
And Gayton McKenzie all he can say is, we need mass deportation of people. And he won't even probably use the word people because we don't consider the word human. It's not in our vocabulary. So, I think that's how complex the our messed up psyche, if you like, as people living in South Africa. We were so divided around identities that were forced on us, from being non-white, from being a non-entity, to then these racial classifications, which mean nothing. And so then you get on top of that this notion of a rainbow nation, when the fundamental divisions of class, race, and gender have not been resolved. We don't have anywhere near the forms of transformation in our country that we're obliged to carry out as per our constitution. Our constitution has a section that in law, this government should be transforming South Africa. And if you think almost 30 years into our democracy, the crisis in the city of Joburg is one of lack of affordable housing for the majority of the people living in the city. If you can afford a house, then you can buy that dignity of having a house. So, I don't know if that answers you, but I do feel that on the one level, our history has damaged us, damaged our soul as people. But I think that the issue of race then repeats itself globally. And if you compare the actual penning of the 1951 convention, it was done for a predominantly white population in Europe. And we must look at how did America receive those white refugees and how were they treated. And today, the hypocrisy of how states across the world are looking at every possible way, including South Africa, of keeping people out, people who have nowhere to go, no refuge, and we're still denying them access.
Sure. I think you touched on something that one of my friends and I were discussing this the other day, that the amount of psychological damage that our history has had on Black people is what is holding us back, right? And it is a trauma that is passed on from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And until we can get to unpacking the psychological damage that had been inflicted on Black people, and as you pointed out, from, identities that were forced onto us, we are going to continue to see this denial of our brothers and sisters across the continent. And it always remains the biggest irony for me, because we are signatured to the African Union, to the African Union's Constitutive Act, to the African Union's, charter on good governance, on elections and democracy. There's this pledge that has been done across the whole continent that situations like this should be very simple and an easy fix, right? And yet that's just not happening. It's just not translating. And just to wrap up, I just wanted you to maybe unpack for me what a human right is and how dignity is crucial in the core of what a human right is, and what it means to be a human that exists for themselves, but also respects others and is respected by others.
So I think I'll start with the negative and to say that our history of colonization and our history of apartheid defines how people who are not treated as human beings. That is our history.
Right.
And the democratization of South Africa came with one of the most powerful constitutions in the world. And it was fought. It wasn't just handed down on a plate.
Right.
And the equality clause in particular was fought in civil society to ensure that it is formulated in the way that it is, which includes that, no discrimination based on sexual orientation, which I think was way ahead of its time, given where we are today, particularly in countries on the African continent. So the cornerstone, the vision, the ethos of our constitution is respect for human rights, and human rights are what inalienable, right? What you should, just being born a human, that's, you should have the right to a decent job, because job, and there's been litigation in court on speaking about the need for human beings to work as part of dignity. And so, the Bill of Rights sets out what are the very basic things that you would need as a human being that should not be up for price. It shouldn't be a consumable good. And I think that that's the distinction. If you should not be able to go to the hospital only and get quality healthcare only because you can pay for it and buy it. Right. Or you couldn't, or access to education shouldn't be the privilege of those who can pay for it. And yet that's what we're seeing in our country, continuing the consumerization of life, the crisis of social reproduction. And I think that the question of social reproduction, understanding that as a species, we have the society, we have children, and what do we need in order to exist as a society? We need to be able to go to school, we need to be able to access healthcare, we need water, we need fresh air, and these are all enshrined in our Bill of Rights because we were denied it in the past. Right. And it's very deliberate that there's actually a legal clause in our constitution that enforces those rights. And on top of that, again, because of our past, it says all who live in this country. And I think that really needs to be unpacked, and it goes directly to migrant labor, to the way in which the white apartheid government kept Black people out of what would have been a only white South Africa. And so those wordings are not accidental. They're not just thrown in there for good measure. They were very deliberate in saying that the Bill of Rights is enshrined to protect all who live in South Africa. And I think that's become the most contentious in our current crisis in how we're managing movement of human beings, of people, in South Africa and in the region.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I think we can end it right there. And thank you for this conversation. It was truly, I think, so much more can be unpacked, and so much more can be spoken about. But due to time constraints, this is where I think we're going to end it. But thank you so much, Sharon, for joining our podcast. I really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was good chatting with you.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all our listeners for joining in for this podcast. I look forward to your feedback. Please make sure to leave us a comment on our social media pages on what you thought of today's podcast. And also make sure to stay in touch with Lawyers for Human Rights. I will attach their social media handles right here below in the podcast. And in case you have forgotten, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you are listening over on YouTube, and that follow button here on Spotify for you to know exactly when we have a new episode for you. With that being said, thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Well, we really hope you enjoyed this episode. Check out our social media pages at DDP_democracy to engage with more of our content, or you can head on over to our website at ddp.org.za to keep up with any events that we might have planned for you. Thank you once again for